Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. Today's topic is GDP, Gross Domestic Product. So that's basically a measure of how much stuff we are producing domestically in our economy. So how much stuff are we producing within the borders of the country? And GDP is often used as kind of an indicator for how well the economy is doing. So when we have a recession, that's kind of defined to be a decline over a period of time in GDP. There's some debate to be had about how good of a measure it is of the economy. And, this gets to questions of what do we want the economy to be doing for us in the first place? Is it just a matter of how much stuff it produces? Obviously, how much stuff it produces is important. But yeah, we'll get into that. Some of us read an article on PBS Making Sense by Gretchen Frazee. And the article is, what is GDP and is it the best way to measure the economy? So kind of the question I just asked. So this article is from about a year ago, July of 2019. And I want to start by going around the room and getting people's initial thoughts. So the question is going to be, to what extent is GDP a useful way of looking at how the economy works? If you have any questions you want to bring up about GDP, and then how does basic income fit in? How does it affect GDP? Can basic income improve the economy even if GDP doesn't change? These kinds of things. So the interaction between GDP and basic income. So we'll go in the order we did introductions, which is going to be Mitchell, Derek, and then Chance to start.
On GDP, do I think that it is the best way to measure it? I don't think the current formula is. Even Simon Kuznets said that he doesn't believe it's no longer being used appropriately. And we have things like parks and stuff like that if you're in a park, you're not necessarily spending money, but it's contributing to happiness. So, yeah.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. If we're measuring the economy, what are we measuring? And are there things that contribute to human happiness that or human well-being that are not necessarily associated directly with the economy, that kind of thing too. Let's go to Derek and then Chance and then Richard.
My first thoughts just right at the opening. This is a good article. I think it lays out very clearly how people are using the term. By the way, I apologize if there's background noise you're hearing here. I guess the first thing I'll say is there's a lot of talk about how GDP is an inadequate measure of societal health and also of economic health. I think those are both probably true. But I do want to say that I think it's probably important that we do have a kind of rough heuristic measure. We need some value, right? You need an econometric value that you can point to that just says, well, overall, the economy is doing X, right? People kind of need that. And the fact that GDP, the fact that it became such a popular metric, I think shows the need for something like that, right? So I don't know, as critics of current economic systems and things, I think it behooves us to really understand what GDP means, and so that we can figure out what is a good alternative measure, right? What can replace it if we feel that it's not quite doing the job.
Great, yeah, and then we can ask the question, what is GDP a good measure of? So let's go to Chance and then Richard and then Martin.
Yeah, so I haven't thought a lot about this, but I typically take the line that Andrew Yang points out that, the guy who invented GDP says it's like a terrible metric for the well-being of the country. And I like his approach of like creating an American scorecard to track all the other things that we also value. But it's still I'm hoping to get a little bit more information about, or just like a better conceptual understanding, like about what we're tracking when we're tracking the GDP. And I see the utility of it overall. We need to have some baseline understanding of like how many resources or like we have, or like what, yeah, it's just like our the total amount of productive capacity we have, so that we can measure from year to year how well we're doing as a whole, like Derek just said.
Cool, great. Let's go to Richard, Martin, and then Steve.
Well, I don't think GDP is particularly useful because if all the conventional data says that GDP's and the economy is going fantastically, and yet people could feel that it's going terribly, and that matters more because the consumers drive so much of the economic growth and things like that, that what they feel matters more than all the data and things like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Maybe it's not a good measure of people's well-being, but does that mean it's completely useless? And my hunch is no. But let's go to Martin, Steve, and then Bethany.
So a couple of thoughts, not so much tied to basic income, but maybe as the discussion unfolds. There's a saying goes something along the lines that some, not all models are perfect, but some are useful. Something, I forget exactly the quote, but there's something along that line. In the comments leading up to the discussion today, I mentioned a book called GDP something, an affectionate, brief but affectionate history. And a couple of amusing, as I was reviewing my notes, a couple of amusing things that came out of it. One is the notion, when you're thinking about GDP, that if a widower marries his housekeeper, the marriage reduces GDP. Another one is this Greek minister. Some may recall some of the Greek financial challenges. The Greek minister was arrested some number of years ago. And what was his crime? His crime was that he was starting to accurately report Greek financial national statistics. So with those is just kind of like a couple of ideas, as far as the utility of GDP, and it's probably not a really good measure of. It's not the end all and be all measurement. Maybe that would be one way to look at it. It's a little bit useful. I guess my last thought is, we're all seeing what's going on today in the economy and the and the virus situation, and yet the stock market is at near highs. At least it hasn't totally tanked. And so if you think of, well, isn't also the stock market a measure of something, like it's discounting the future of economic output? And you'd almost sort of wonder, how can the stock market be where it is today? And yet, but then if you look around, right? So anyway, those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we can ask the question, is GDP as a concept useful, and what does it mean? And then we can ask the question, how well are we even measuring it to begin with, or is it reflecting the thing we wanted to reflect? I think those are interesting points. Let's go to Steve, Bethany, and then Eddie.
Okay, I have a lot of problems with GDP, but I think it can be saved. I've been trying to think of a GDP for basic essential goods. And then it'd be nice if there was a gross domestic demand for essential goods. And then you see if gross essential demand was met by essential supply. In any case, you'd be talking about essential or basic or important items like food and housing. And then you would see how well you're succeeding. My problem with the GDP is it mixes the important and the completely unimportant to potentially get a gigantic number.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because we do draw the line somewhere. We don't include, financial products in GDP, for example. But where is the appropriate place to draw the line? And does it make sense to weight different things differently potentially instead of maybe just measuring it all in dollars? Let's go to Bethany, Eddie, and then Joan.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts and it's tricky. So one thought I have is kind of like, what is GDP supposed to be measuring right now? Which I kind of have a handle on, but not completely. And then to Derek's point, like, how is it taken? Well, sort of to Derek's point, like, it seems like it's taken as kind of like, how well is the country doing or how well is the economy doing, which is probably broader than what it's supposed to be measuring. And even more to Derek's point, like, is that unavoidable? Are we going to have to pick a measure that's always going to be taken that way? Or like maybe Eddie said, or someone else said, could we have more of like a scorecard of several metrics that measure different aspects of the economy, let alone like well-being outside of the economy? So I guess I'm still kind of muddled on these different questions, but hopefully we'll get more clarity towards the end. I guess one last thought, just sort of as an example from reading the article, is, for example, there are two different economies that could have the same GDP, like one where most of the citizens are quite prosperous, and one, I think, if I understand GDP correctly, where like a small number of people are spending a ton of money and everybody else is spending like no money. So that also seems like a limitation depending on what it's supposed to be capturing. So I'd like to kind of explore those different things too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that's something that the people who talk about inequality often compare countries of similar GDP and then talk about the different distribution and how that affects things. Let's go to Eddie, Joan. Yeah, Eddie and then Joan, that's it.
So I think that GDP is a decent measure of production, but I think it ignores something that most economists ignore in general, which is the differentiation between labor and capital. If you think about, even if we throw away the trading economy and we throw away the concept of money, even if you're, the Swiss Family Robinson on a desert island, you can actually differentiate labor and capital. The Austrian economists like to say that capital is crystallized labor, and I think that makes sense. They talk about direct production and indirect production. So, direct production is if, you decide you need to solve a problem today and you solve the problem today. Indirect production capital is when you realize that, some problems such as having shelter or getting food or anything needs to be solved every single day for the rest of your life. And then you go and you build something such as a house that will work, that will provide something every day, for its own lifetime. And this is important because all of the production in the economy is created by a mixture of labor and capital. And as the economy advances and productivity increases, that mix becomes ever more skewed towards more and more capital, combined with a relatively flat amount of labor. And so you do end up with this, enormous amount of production, and the makeup, the wealth makeup of society kind of mirrors this. The income makeup of society mirrors this, that you have an enormous amount of capital and, owned by wealthy people that makes a great deal of money, and a relatively, stagnant amount of labor input into the economy, and also the economic value of the labor is also relatively stagnant. And as a result, most people, if you wanted a really fair economy and you could just, you had a magic wand, and you made it so that every single person in the economy owned assets, you would end up with everyone having the same amount of income. But unfortunately, most people, for many different reasons, they don't own assets, and most people only make their income through labor. And so as a result, as the economy advances, they're kind of left behind, which is why we need UBI. The other thing that is missing, just very quickly, is like a time and understanding of the evolution of the movements of the system over time, the time characteristics of the economy, the ways that the different things feed back into each other, such as aggregate demand and labor demand. That's all I have for now.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like your point about UBI being similar to what you would see if everyone owned kind of equal assets or something like that, because they'd be getting that passive income from the assets. Let's go to Joan and then Austin for initial thoughts.
Yeah, I'm going to pass, Alex. I'm just here to learn. I'm not sure what's happening. Okay.
Sounds good. A lot of people aren't sure what's happening. Let's go to Austin if you have some initial thoughts, Austin, on GDP and basic income. Yep, looks like we don't have Austin yet. So yeah, I think something that people I think kept bringing up again and again in their comments is whether GDP is a good way to kind of measure the well-being of the people, or whether we'd want to use something else. And I think it's a little bit, since we kind of tend to use GDP in that way, we see that it's not maybe serving that purpose optimally. We need to be careful not to turn that into an indictment of GDP itself. It's just a measure of something in particular, and we want to understand what that measure is. So we could have a discussion about what is used, like how do we tell how prosperous our people are? And I think there's a lot of factors that you would want to look at. But I think how much stuff they're able to buy is a big part of it. At least that's the part that's related to the economy, right? There are certain things that you don't get from the economy, and it's the part that basic income supports. But how much stuff you're able to buy is also not the same thing as how much stuff the economy is producing in total. And as Bethany was pointing out, some countries might have the same GDP as each other, but in one country, there are people who are able to buy a lot of stuff. In another country, there are a lot of people who aren't able to buy very much stuff. In the country where there are poor people who aren't able to buy very much stuff is going to be worse off. So that's something that's important to pay attention to. So there's that aspect of GDP. Then there's also the kind of the fact that we're talking about the product, and the fact that we're talking about the domestic product. So should what matters for the economy be how much stuff we are producing in general, including for other people, or does it matter more how much stuff is being produced or able to be bought by our consumers, rather than how much stuff is being produced by our producers? So I think this is an important thing to pay attention to with GDP as well, or with, when we want to think about even not just people's well-being in general, but even the performance of the economy. So GDP is maybe important because it's what you can trade with the rest of the world, and what you can trade with the rest of the world, and produce domestically for your own citizens. But it's also what you what you can potentially trade with the rest of the world, and that's related to what you can get from the rest of the world. But as we've seen in our discussions of Dutch disease and international trade, that's not the whole story behind what you can get from the rest of the world. And ultimately, what's closer to the well-being of the citizens, at least when it comes to the economy, is what can they buy? What is being produced for them? What are they potentially able to consume rather than produce? So in a closed economy, obviously these things are more equivalent to each other. But when you are in a global economy and you're isolating to a domestic thing, I think what you'd probably want to focus on ultimately, in terms of maximizing everyone's well-being, is what's being done for the people rather than what you're doing in general, productively or something like that. Richard, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Well, what Eddie was talking about, well, there are different economic systems and they have their own, versions of GDP. And right after the Soviet Union collapsed, the citizens received their own shares of all the different industries, and they didn't understand what the shares, how they function in the economy. And so oligarchs bought out a bunch of the shares, and that's how they created all their companies. And that's how what Bethany was talking about earlier about there can be a bunch of people buying different things, or with a few people buying out everything. And that's how Russia is currently. And that's how they affect the performance of the economy. Right now, Russia's economy is rather stagnant, and they don't really produce all that much. And like they want to start their own Silicon Valley, and so they created it there. They're a version of it, but no one wants to go there. They rather go to America's Silicon Valley. And then in America, they have like trying to create their Silicon Valleys in different states. Like there's one in like Iowa, but that attracts some people because the cost of living is so low, but it's not particularly successful. But with a basic income, they would be able to spread things out in these various locations, because they could go to like Louisiana or something like that, and they could create their own industry, or they can have, as like 5G and things like that is spread over more, they can like work from home and things like that, and they can spread GDP out throughout the entire U.S. instead of having it focused in like Boston and like San Francisco and New York City and things like that.
Yeah, those are some interesting thoughts, and I like what you said about Russia trying to boost their GDP in these ways. And we see this, we see it in China and pretty much everywhere, right? And I think you guys have probably heard Goodhart's law before. That's when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So whenever you are using a particular metric as an indicator of something else, if you start changing that metric, it's not necessarily going to change the thing you're using it as an indicator for, right? That depends on various, causal relationships and stuff in the economy. So if all you're doing is boosting GDP, like building cities where no one's going to live, or smashing, windows and rebuilding them, that kind of thing, or war, right? War is great for GDP. Then you've helped boost your measure. You've helped boost when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So you've helped boost your target, but then it's not measuring anything useful anymore. And I think that's something similar is what we see with employment, right? On its own, in an efficient labor market, maybe the level of employment is a reasonable indicator of how much stuff we're producing, even, or how productive the economy is, how vibrant and dynamic the economy is. But if you're targeting labor, if you're trying to bring the economy to full employment, then it's no longer an indicator of that anymore. So let's go to Bethany.
Yeah, so two things. I guess the first is whether you could restate kind of what we should be thinking of GDP as attempting to measure ideally, because otherwise it's hard for me to think about what to go into it. And then the second thing, if I understand correctly, another thing about GDP is it's the dollar amounts of what are being traded, right? So I'm also trying to wrap my head around this idea that, like, if somebody buys a $2 million piece of art, I think that's like equivalent for GDP as $2 million worth of hamburgers or something like that. So there's, again, I guess depending on what we're trying to measure, that's giving me some pause as well, because I think intuitively those things are kind of different in terms of how much the economy is producing and how much people are able to buy. And so, yeah, that's another thought I wanted to raise.
Yeah, so this is kind of a little bit of what Eddie was getting at, that GDP doesn't differentiate between, all these different kinds of things you can produce. And he was pointing out that, GDP could be stuff that's being produced for consumers now, or it could be capital that we're building for investment in the future. Or it could be, if you're just buying a piece of art from someone who already has it, then that doesn't count as GDP because you're just kind of trading something in the secondary market. If you're the painter and you're selling your art for the first time, that might count towards GDP. I'm not I'm not sure, but yeah, it's a really good point. So how useful is GDP in measuring that? And ultimately, what it's supposed to be an indicator of is how much stuff, goods and services and investment and all of that our economy is producing. If you think of the economy as a machine that generates stuff, it's how much stuff. So intuitively that makes sense, but then when you start to poke at the details, it gets more complicated than that. But at least that can be kind of your anchor in what it's supposed to be about.
It's supposed to be how much stuff the economy is producing, you said?
Yeah, domestically. Okay. Within our borders.
As different from what people can buy, as you pointed out, because some of it could be producing for foreign countries or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. And some of it could be investment, which isn't something that consumers would buy right now, but maybe it increases, our potential productive capacity in the future.
Gotcha. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. So let's go to Steve.
Yeah, I was thinking that if a government chooses a policy to maximize GDP, it makes for some weird incentives. For instance, it might be better to make expensive stuff for rich people just to boost GDP. It might make sense for the government to just buy more stuff to make the economy look better. It's possible that inflation would be encouraged just because it would make the prices of everything go up for no particular reason. And as you mentioned, it encourages the economy to make jobs and start making stuff it wouldn't ordinarily make, just to get more jobs. And these unneeded jobs would make GDP go up. So it looks like unneeded jobs are actually helping the economy. In the meantime, like the article says, the work of robots would add to GDP, but the work of human stay-at-home caregivers, does not add to GDP, and that seems to be exactly wrong. That's all.
Yeah, and the question about whether it's wrong, I think it's hard to say. I mean, intuitively, like Martin was saying in the book, you marry the housekeeper and then GDP goes down because you're no longer paying for that service. It's within the household. But I think it also makes sense to the economy is allocating resources through trade. It makes sense to kind of measure that. What's going on in terms of the market economy. And there are things that people are doing productively and things that benefit people that are outside of that. I still think it's useful to measure that. And there are some things that might be happening in the market economy today that are not happening in the market economy tomorrow, but they're still happening. So everyone's well-being stays the same, but your measure of what's going on in the market economy, maybe GDP has shrunk or something like that. So that's also interesting too. So let's go to Austin. Let's go to Austin.
Hey, first of all, sorry I'm late, but anyhow, a couple of quick sort of thoughts. I'm just trying to organize my own thinking on this at the moment. One thing is I know that there's an important difference between nominal GDP and purchasing power parity GDP when we're talking about measuring a nation, beg your pardon, whether we're measuring in international dollars or local purchasing power. So, for example, China has a higher purchasing power GDP than the US by now, I think, or at least it's very close. Whereas if you look in nominal terms, the US is still miles and miles ahead. So it's about the clout of the economy in international trade and who's the dominant partner, I beg your pardon, truck going past, in terms of negotiations and stuff like that. That matters, which one you're using. But also, I was confused when you said that the stuff that's available for sale is not part of GDP, because so I always imagine, my understanding always was, I buy a pair of shoes that's imported from, an American company made in China. I buy the shoes in Australia. The full price of that sale goes into Australia's GDP, right? Or is that sort of the cost of the export somehow minused from that GDP when it's calculated.
Yeah, that's right. When GDP is calculated, you subtract out the imports and add the exports, or you keep the exports, you subtract out the imports.
I see. So, well, I mean, which has the effect of if when someone's buying an Australian-made product overseas, at least part of that's not the actual retail, but the import price ends up showing up on Australia's balance sheet. So
that's right. That's right. And then there are other measures like GNP and GNI, which is, like there's you have a measure for whichever combination of domestic foreign production or whatever. The one I like is called domestic absorption, which is how much stuff consumers are buying or how much stuff is being produced for your domestic economy, rather than how much stuff your domestic economy is producing for everyone. Yeah. So let's go to Martin.
So I was just going to, well, I had a quick comment since people were bringing up art. I was looking for the quote out of the book once again, but something to the effect, so GDP and productivity, and there's some sort of linkage, at least in sort of thinking about things. So the book asks the question, would anybody have encouraged Picasso to paint faster because, it would increase his productivity? And so there's the sort of the element or the idea there that is yet something else that isn't necessarily captured in GDP.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think in some ways he already was painting faster, but yeah. So Soraya is actually on the YouTube live stream today, and she says that she thinks a good measure of well-being is the social determinants of health, which factors in economic stability, environment, education, food, community, and healthcare. Yeah, and that's an interesting question. What are the appropriate measures for measuring an individual person's well-being, and then what are the appropriate measures for measuring the overall well-being of society as well? Let's go to Derek.
The topic of conversation kind of came back around to my point. I wanted to elaborate on, I think, Alex's response to a question or something that Steve pointed out. And it is this question of kind of what's left out, right? What's left out in these measures. And I guess I wanted to caution that one critique I see of GDP a lot is people say that, okay, well, my art, right? It doesn't measure that. Or if I decide to do my own housekeeping instead of hiring a housekeeper, that doesn't contribute to GDP, right? So there must be something wrong with the measure. But I guess I would say that I'm not sure it would be a good thing for us to force things to have economic value that don't. That is to say, that have trading value that other people are going to give you money for. It doesn't mean the thing isn't valuable just because it's not showing up there, right? And I can imagine a society which has a pretty efficient, reasonably run economy, but that also has just a lot of cool stuff going on that's not part of that and doesn't have to be part of that, right? And so this is just to say that, again, whatever GDP is trying to measure, kind of raw economic performance, monetary performance, that's important. We need something like that. And we don't necessarily need it to value unpaid housework, unpaid labor, because that stuff is unpaid, right? So the question really is, if the measure if as a macro measure, right, GDP is not quite right because it doesn't show the benefit that's going to all the consumers necessarily. We could be producing lots of things for rich people and the poor could be going without. We could be wasteful government spending and that could increase GDP, right? All of that's true. So we need the macro measure that solves that actually says, well, how is the economy really benefiting people? How do we put a number on that, right? What variable do we have that can measure that? And I think that would be the alternative. We don't necessarily need to force things to have economic value that otherwise don't.
Yeah, so I think the measure that we have that can really reflect how well the economy is performing for the people is if we have basic income and we calibrate it to the maximum level the economy can sustain, bring it to its natural level, what level do we achieve? And then you are measuring both the economy's potential, and you're also ensuring that the economy is able to fulfill its potential. Not with the stuff you do at home and the value that's created outside of the economy, but it's isolating the part of the economy, it's isolating the part of our society where people have to trade with each other or pay each other to produce things, and it's measuring how much of that we're going to get. So I think basic income is both. I think basic income is a measure of that if you are kind of just automatically calibrating the basic income to what the economy can handle. So my hope is that someday down the road, we're not going to be looking at economies in terms of GDP. We're going to be looking at, okay, well, what level of basic income have we achieved? How much stuff can people just buy from the economy without necessarily having to work for it, or that kind of thing. But maybe then I'd be missing some important parts as well. But it would certainly reflect the well-being of at least the economy's contribution to the well-being of the poorest people. So let's go to Bethany.
Yeah, I like that point. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about basic income as a measure in this way. But what I was originally going to say is, I guess the short point on what Martin's comment, I think his comment indicates that another thing GDP doesn't include is kind of like quality, like the quality of products that are being produced versus just like their cost. I don't know, maybe quality and cost go together to some degree, but I'm not sure how closely. I guess I have to think about it. But then my other question was, so thinking about basic income, if people spend more of their time, like if people are spending more time on leisure activities and kind of trading off that with paid work, or maybe even that with buying things, I guess that would decrease GDP, which maybe is fine, but in a way that might reflect like people doing more of this interesting unpaid work or just like activities that they like. So that would be another case in which like well-being and GDP might be negatively related to each other, if I'm understanding correctly. Maybe you can speak to whether that's accurate. But
yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. If you imagine that people are getting some of their well-being from the market economy, and then they're getting some of their well-being from things that are outside of economic trade and all of that kind of stuff, then and resources are being used up by both, right? So if you imagine that there's more of this societal well-being that's using up resources and coming from outside of the economy, then you'd expect less to be happening through market incentives, through trade, through people spending money on production, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you could certainly imagine a world where people are better off, and the market economy part of what's making people well off is smaller.
And would basic income affect that balance, do you think? I'm trying to think about that.
Well, I think basic income is going to, it funds the market. So it funds the market economy side of things. You could imagine a world in which the kind of activities that are outside of the economy are just so amazing. Like we've come up with some kind of virtual reality, whatever, that everyone is just like really into and nobody wants to work. And then that reduces the level of basic income and reduces the level of economic output, but everyone's happier or something like that.
I see. Yeah. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. Let's go to Austin.
I wanted to follow on a little bit from what Derek was saying, and I think it was Steve talking about art before then. It's like right now, artists, including the very talented, psycho crazy ones, are under a lot of pressure to turn themselves into little units of economic output and produce, a high volume of work which can be sold. Like if you're unsuccessful, then that's the case, and if you start to become successful, there's pressure from dealers and the art economy around you to produce more work, more content, get it out there so we can sell it. We can, and in our society at the moment, that really validates the artist as a real artist as well. Like you're not a real artist if your work isn't selling for above sort of $3,000 a piece, or something like that. And so that fits in with. I mean, I'm certain that there are, from the artists I know, there are people who would produce way less work. And spend much more time developing themselves. They may, after 5 years, end up producing much higher quality, better works that end up selling for, hundreds of thousands or whatever. And I think there's an interesting thing where what would happen is the introduction of a UBI would immediately shrink GDP because a bunch of activity that couldn't happen before, because people would starve if they took the time to do it, happens. But then in the longer term, you'd shift from low quality production to high quality production, because there's no point employing someone to make cheap stuff, right? Like, you only employ someone if you can really get good value out of them, and you would only sort of bother selling your art. Like, the economic activity would shift to higher value, is my guess. And, that would include art and include stuff like that. The sort of lower value stuff would be displaced by non-market activity. So I'm not going to catch a bus and eat a shitty hot dog and all the stuff that I do on my way to get to work, because I'm going to say, no, leisure time is more valuable than that. But then by the time, when you actually do what's actually going to get me to engage with the market is some product that's way more valuable and way more worthwhile, and I can't get, from a homemade version.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I do have some thoughts on that. But let's go to Derek first and get his thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to say I thought that was interesting too. I think that I think it's very correct that there's probably large sectors of the current economy that we've kind of amplified and enlarged primarily to increase their ability to deliver incomes to people in ways that maybe intuitively we didn't think they needed to, right? There is a kind of intuitive sense that, well, artists don't need money. That's not what it's about, right? I think that's actually a correct intuition, but then it puts the artists in this really awful position where they have to be making pretty tough choices there, right? So UBI will solve that, and it will probably demonetize large sectors of the economy. At the same time, the section of the economy that we think of like traditional, economics, goods and stuff on shelves and groceries and things like that, UBI will allow people to get a lot more, to buy a lot more of that, and will allow producers to produce a lot more of it. So I wouldn't say necessarily that basic income I wouldn't predict that it would decrease GDP. It may actually increase it, because as the certain unnecessary sectors are being demonetized, you're going to amplify the ones that actually are kind of rearing to go, but we're restraining them, right? Because we're not giving people the money to buy those things. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There are kind of two competing forces. There's people having access to more money to spend and being able to spend more just by virtue of receiving the basic income. And then there's the reduction in potential income from other sources and kind of a reduction in spending on those things that goes along with it. And that can be both because artists aren't desperately trying to generate money for themselves anymore, so they're focusing more on making better art, and it can also be because our economic policy shifts, our monetary policy shifts, and as people receive more income from the UBI, we use less monetary policy to prop up consumers and stuff like that. So I think all of that is right. I guess we lost Austin. I was going to go back to him, yeah, I think my intuition is that GDP would go up under basic income. And kind of the way I think about it is that you imagine increasing the basic income a little bit and kind of what the effect of that is. And then you see these kind of second order effects that follow from that. So maybe there's I'm an artist, my income is higher. That means I can produce a little bit less art and still have enough income. It doesn't strike me that there would be some effect where people's income would go up and then it would cause their incomes to go down by even more than that, at least in aggregate, right? So I think. Yeah, my intuition is that GDP on its own, GDP would go up with basic income, but kind of as Bethany was saying, there's this trade-off between the the stuff that's produced in the economic engine and then the stuff that people kind of do productively on their own, and also with investment as well. Go ahead, Eddie.
I think it's an interesting question. I think what you'll end up with is actually like a very nice societal choice, kind of individual choices aggregated. I think initially, increasing, because the economy right now is held back so much by people on the bottom, of the income pyramid, not having enough money to spend. As you first put UBI in and make, have everybody have enough money to spend, the GDP would go up. And additionally, as GDP grew, as aggregate demand grows due to UBI, that would increase labor demand, and so wages would actually also increase as that happened, and then you would actually get to a point where everybody has UBI and they're making more money, from their wages. At some point, they get to a point where they can either go from 60,000 to 120,000 to $200,000 of income and have more money to spend, or they can say, you know what, $80,000 is plenty. I just want to spend half my time, as an unpaid artist, and half my time making money. And so I think that will be a very good and very interesting choice. That's basically a post-scarcity society, which is only possible, I've realized in the past year, by giving people a UBI. Because if you don't give people a UBI, instead of productivity growth making everything available to people very cheaply, productivity growth actually hurts people on the income side, because they're competing with capital for their earnings. And so, instead of boosting everybody up to post scarcity, it actually squashes the people who are earning money by selling their labor, because their labor is no longer as necessary in the economy.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question whether basic income would cause wages to go up. And my intuition, and I'll tell you why, is that it wouldn't. Is that it would in aggregate, on average, it would cause wages to go down. And that's because what you're doing is you're essentially substituting one mechanism of getting spending money to consumers with another. So you're introducing basic income. That means it allows us to reduce wages in the economy. So remember, wages are largely not determined, by a free market or something like that. The level of wages that people receive is determined by economic policy designed to kind of create jobs and boost wages. So we'd have less of that. So even if overall economic output goes up, some of that output, a lot of that output, is being potentially bought by the income people receive from the basic income. So I guess I have a hard time imagining where a scenario in which wages on average would go up across the economy due to a basic income. Does that make sense?
I think that those economic policies work through the free market, though. I mean, the economic policies don't actually go in and say, okay, we're going to pay X amount per hour for people who work at McDonald's. That's all determined by the market, throughout the labor market. And the economic policy only works indirectly by stimulating the entire economy, in the hopes that wages will go up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. But if you imagine the introduction of a basic income, that causes the Fed to tighten, right? So maybe a lot of those McDonald's close, or a lot of those jobs go away, that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead.
So I actually don't think the Fed policy is very effective at bringing the wages up. And on the other side, as the UBI goes up, I don't think, McDonald's might close, but they might open more, Chili's, because people have more money to spend.
Sure.
But, I think the monetary policy, when they tighten it, it won't have any direct effect on wages. And in fact, I think it will have very little, even none, no effect on wages, because the economy overall will be supported by UBI instead of by the monetary policy.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it would be supported by UBI instead of the monetary policy, but instead of the monetary policy also means instead of the employment policy, right? Because the main mechanism by which monetary policy operates is that it makes it easier for businesses to borrow money and hire workers and that kind of thing. And I know you said you're skeptical of that, how strong that effect is, but well, I don't know. I think some other people have some comments on this line of discussion. So let's go to Derek.
Well, I think there's maybe, I run into this a lot. I think there's kind of two different basic ways of looking at wages at a macro level. I mean, we can look at a wage as, because it is true, I think, that they're determined on the individual level, the micro level, they're determined by real bargaining power and by the company's perceived need to pay that amount to that worker, right? And so when people talk about, we want to raise wages, we want wages to be higher, they're kind of wishing for all of those individual decisions to be higher somehow, right? And that's one way of looking at wages in the macro picture. But then another way of looking at it is, I think, what Alex called the level of wages in the economy, like how many wage payers are there in the economy, right? And so I think that if you're looking at wages as an income distribution system, which is kind of what it is and kind of what the monetary policy influences, that's what the basic income will sort of outcompete. Now, while that occurs, there might be all sorts of little sectors where that the amount of wage goes up. I can imagine that occurring in a lot of different sectors. I mean, particularly like automation specialists, right? They're going to get really high wages. Nevertheless, wages in aggregate, right? The level of wages in the economy are going to be going away because the jobs are going away. So, and I think those are just two different things I wanted to separate, right? Like maybe the amount of wages isn't higher. I don't know if they're going to be driven up higher on average, but I think we can say for sure that the level of wages, like how much wages, how dominant wages are in the economy, is going to be outpaced by the UBI.
Yeah, so like the level of income, the total amount of income that people get from wages is likely to decrease. Let's go to Bethany.
I think this might be redundant with what Derek just said, but I was also going to posit that couldn't it be that, with a basic income, there are a lot of people not working at all, but the average wage for somebody who is working is actually higher. So, even though we're not using economic policy to push as much of people's income to them, sort of as a percentage or whatever, like you still have the average level of income higher. And I don't know if that would happen, honestly, but like it could happen if like the temptation to just not take a job is really high. And so like then we don't need that many people to work. And so you have to like pay those few people quite a bit to get them to give up their time, basically. So that does seem like one possible scenario. So I'm curious. That might be what you just said, Derek. If it is, I'm sorry to say it again, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, especially if we're thinking about like, well, what is the definition of work? What does it mean to have a job if you're doing work that's not paid? Like, right now we have a clear definition because we have kind of a minimum wage cutoff and you're either employed or you're not. What does it mean if the labor market is just sometimes you pay people to do things, right? And it's a more kind of like informal thing. So then you can ask what wages are, I guess, the aggregate of what people pay to do other people to do things. But then if you're asking what's people's average wage, if you're not getting paid anything, then maybe that goes down or something like that. And you can, like when you have the introduction of the basic income, it gives people more freedom. So it gives people more freedom to say no to a job that doesn't pay enough. It gives people more freedom to say yes to spending their time in a way that doesn't pay very much because they can actually afford to do it. Let's go back to Eddie because I feel like Eddie probably has some responses here.
So if you think about the relevant supply and demand curve that gets affected, as the UBI comes in, people have more money to spend, so aggregate demand is likely to go up. When aggregate demand goes up, businesses see more demand, and when businesses see more demand, then they're likely to hire more. If their stores, if their business is very, very busy, they need to produce more because everybody has money to buy. They'll need to they'll need to hire. So your labor demand curve is going to go up. The economy is going to need more labor to take care of all the spending that the UBI supports. On the other hand, what goes down, because we're asking a question about the quantity and the price. What goes down is the labor supply, which is that the people providing the labor, they now have another source of income, and so they would not need to sell their labor as much or as urgently. And so if you have more of a choice, because you're getting, a $2,000 a month UBI, and you can work or not work, or you can take care of your kids, or, go get some more education or whatever, that reduces supply of the market. So demand going up for labor and supply going down for labor, is going to cause the price to go upwards. So the quantity, whether the quantity goes up or down, whether you have people working more or working less, again, I think that actually ends up being determined by the labor supplier, by the person to decide if they want to work or not. The quantity might, stay the same for a while, but it might go down in the future. But I think the price definitely goes up. And again, I want to emphasize that there's no separate employment policy, other than monetary policy and fiscal policy, which are both geared towards increasing aggregate demand enough that you have enough labor demand. But there's nothing in monetary or fiscal policy that actually goes directly to the worker. It all works through the debt market. So monetary policy makes more money available to businesses through borrowing, but it does not at all send money directly to workers. So
okay, I'm going to go ahead and disagree with both your demand side argument and your supply side argument. And I disagree with the demand side argument because basic income is not just more money for consumers. It is a substitution. We have mechanisms to get spending money into consumers' hands now, and basic income is a substitution with a more efficient mechanism to get spending money into consumers. Overall, it's probably going to end up being more money, but the main effect is that you're substituting out the old way of doing it, and you're substituting in the new way of doing it. So that's kind of my demand side point. And then the supply side point is that currently we are paying people to spend their time unproductively. That's a big part of how we're getting money to consumers. We're keeping people employed in jobs that don't necessarily need to be there. If you're not doing that anymore, then you're actually freeing up people's time and energy to be more productive in other ways. You're not paying them not to produce anymore. We don't have an efficient labor market. So if you had an efficient labor market, then you could talk about the demand and supply for labor. But right now, we're not using the labor market as a market for getting people to do things. We're using it as a way to kind of funnel money to consumers. So if you're not doing that anymore, it frees up people's time to be more productive with their time, and that actually might increase the supply of labor, because now people have more freedom to spend their time productively. So you're both decreasing the demand for labor and increasing the supply, because you're decreasing the demand. Not necessarily decreasing the demand, but you're not necessarily increasing the demand, because you're not like causing people to spend more money. That's not the main effect, although there will be some of that. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
How does if you're willing to go into the mechanism, how the substitution works, however, the reason that the mechanism for the substitution occurs when consumers have money in their pocket, so they don't have to sell their labor. So it's a reduction in supply. It's not a reduction in demand. Would you agree with that?
Not exactly, because they don't have to sell their labor, but right now they're selling their labor unproductively, largely, right? We're keeping people employed as a way of getting them money. So if you're reducing the amount of that, it frees people up to spend their time more productively, including, more productive labor potentially, especially since now you have the now you have a more efficient labor market, and the demand will only really activate productive labor.
So the way that we keep people employed unproductively, if you look at the details of it, it has to do with monetary policy, right?
Right.
So monetary policy makes funds, easily, almost freely available, easily available, very cheaply available to companies. So they're looking at the companies, look and say, wow, we can borrow money for, just 5%. Maybe it does make sense to expand more. So, what you're, let's see. So the reason people are unproductive is that the companies have such cheap money that even though, hiring this person only adds just a tiny little bit to the bottom line, they're still going to hire this person. I mean, they're not going to hire a person that is just a flat expense to the company. They're not going to actually hire someone to sit there 20 hours, 40 hours a day and not do anything. I mean, they think that at some level, definitely this person will add a little bit to the bottom line.
Approximately,
and money's so cheap that we might as well.
That's right. Approximately speaking, at the level of the employer, you're never going to hire a worker unless it's profitable to do so. But what the monetary policy does is it makes businesses potentially profitable that wouldn't otherwise be profitable if there wasn't such expansionary monetary policy.
Right. So my point is that instead of giving the companies cheap money that they can borrow, what UBI does is shift the money away from the debt markets to the consumers. And instead of giving them cheap money that they can borrow, it puts all the money in the hands of the consumer so that the companies can be profitable by offering what the consumers demand. So the businesses still have a supply of money, but their supply of money becomes, instead of getting to borrow it very cheaply, they get to receive it from customers if they can offer something good, because the customers have lots of money available to spend. So the businesses, that's my point. The businesses still end up, I would say they end up more busy, because doesn't really take much work or many laborers for them to borrow money on the bond market. But if they have more money coming in from a different avenue, which is through their customers' hands, they will be more busy, and they will actually need to hire more people. But if people are not willing to work, they may have to pay people very well. And then if they have to pay people very well, then they may find that, we better, invest in more productivity, in more productivity growth, and more automation, because labor wages are so high that it doesn't make sense anymore to hire people and have them be really unproductive. Because it made sense when people were only like, $10, $15 an hour. But now that the labor market is the demand is full, and people, the labor market is not as saturated by supply, the price goes up. It goes up to $30 an hour, and now it doesn't make sense to have all those unproductive jobs anymore. They get replaced by automation where they can.
So I'll say where I agree with you. If the labor supply contracts and people are less willing to work, that, everything else equal, will cause wages to go up. If demand increases in the context of an efficient labor market, and people want to buy more stuff, and we can actually potentially have the capacity to produce more stuff, that's going to pull wages up because businesses want to be more productive. So I agree with you on both of those points. I'm not convinced that basic income will. I'm not convinced that the supply and demand effects of basic income are what you say they are. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I
so
guess.
I think the price will go up. the quantity is hard to say. It could go up, it could go down. But
so
the
you're
price,
okay. I
definitely
see.
goes
So
up.
so you're thinking that. So this is kind of what Bethany was getting at.
So,
You're
so
thinking
people could work the same amount, or they might work less, but the price of labor will go up.
So you're thinking there might be fewer workers who are paid more. Okay.
Yeah. Or the same amount of workers who are paid more.
Yeah.
Also possible. Yeah.
I mean, I think the main thing that seems intuitive to me is that the overall level of wages would go down, the amount of wages that are being paid out, because you're kind of substituting in basic income for a lot of it. But that, like, could you also have a scenario where there are fewer people working and those fewer people are paid more? I think potentially, yeah.
I think the labor makeup of the production would definitely go down. So you might have production GDP going way up, but the total amount of wages paid, the aggregate amount of wages paid might stay kind of similar, but production just goes way up instead.
Yeah. So I guess what you're describing is a world in which consumer incomes from wages stays the same, and then consumers in aggregate get the income from the basic income on top of that, and then the reason you're able to maintain stable prices, or if we're just talking in real terms, then that has to correspond to an increase in output that exactly matches the additional spending from the basic income. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sold on that, but at least we've kind of defined what we're talking about. So that's good.
Very cool.
Yeah, good stuff. If anyone else has any comments, feel free to raise your hand. We have actually a lot of comments on the YouTube live stream. So the Everyday Progressive says GDP would increase as consumer spending would increase. GDP is already 70% consumer spending. Broke people can't spend what they don't have. So I think that's true that broke people can't spend what they don't have, and the economy won't produce what people lack the money to buy. So I think we agree that generally, I guess we're saying GDP, but I would probably be more precise and say, like, what's being produced for our consumers would increase. Total consumer income would increase, and what's being produced for our consumers would increase as well. Yeah, if you had a basic income. Let's see. And then David on the live stream says, I think GDP is a useful measure of a nation's ability to engage in 19th and 20th century total war. So maybe not. So you don't get the bump in GDP until you actually go to war. So you can't measure your ability to engage in war by looking at the GDP, because the GDP comes after you go to war. But I kind of get what you're saying, that war can boost economic output in maybe a way that's not beneficial to people. Yeah, so let's get into a quote from the article. Where is it? There it is. Okay, real GDP accounts for the value of goods and services produced. That means the sum of all of America's stuff for sale, plus the value of intangible stuff that people do, minus the effects of inflation. GDP per capita measures the value of goods and services if it were divided equally among every person in a country. GDP growth measures the difference in GDP from 1 year or 1 3-month period, quarter, to the next. So I think this is pretty straightforward. The main thing they're getting at here, or the main thing she's getting at here, is the distinction between real GDP and nominal GDP. So if we are thinking in terms of real GDP, then that makes it a little bit simpler, because we're actually looking at how much stuff the economy is producing, and we are not worried about changes in the purchasing power of the dollar. So maybe there's 5 billion more GDP or something like that, but it doesn't count if the value of the dollar went down by a corresponding amount or something like that. I always like to imagine that an ideal dollar is stable in its purchasing power, so that real GDP and nominal GDP end up being the same thing, and then it's simpler for everyone, including the participants in the economy and anyone who's trying to analyze it. Yeah, Bethany, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. So when she says the intangible things, she's talking about services that people pay for. Is that the idea? Yeah.
Yeah, basically, yep.
Just because we've all been distinguishing between like paid and unpaid things that people do, et cetera. So I just wanted to make sure it was clear what that means.
So these are all paid things. So economists tend to think of services as just another kind of consumable good in the economy. Yeah. Yeah. So that's so then there's the distinction here between the kind of total output, the per capita. Even if you're doing per capita, you're kind of just averaging among everyone. So you're not really getting a sense of how the poorest people are doing in the economy. If you have something like a basic income as your mechanism for getting spending money to people, then that helps even out what everyone's getting and what everyone's able to purchase in the economy. And then I think that brings GDP, or I keep saying GDP, but what's being produced for our consumers gets more spread out evenly among the consumers, and can give you a better sense of the welfare of those consumers, how well they're doing. Go ahead, Bethany.
Well, I was just going to say, it seems like if there's substantial inequality, then averaging, across the number of people doesn't really tell you much about how a lot of people are doing, depending on how many people are kind of left out of this economy to what degree.
That's right. And then just the, I kind of keep harping on this, and maybe I shouldn't, but just the fact that we're talking about what's being produced instead of what people are able to buy or what people are able to consume is problematic there as well.
It still seems relevant, because obviously if you're a country of 10 people, that GDP means something different than if you're a country of 1 million people or 1 billion people, the same number. But I was just pointing out that it doesn't necessarily talk about who's benefiting from it within that.
Yeah, that's right. So it doesn't talk about who's benefiting from it. It doesn't even talk about whether the people who are benefiting from it are even your own citizens. Right.
Oh yeah, good point, because you could be selling it all to another country or something.
That's right. That's kind of what I was getting at. So it's not just about, is it distributed unevenly among the people of the country? Is it even being distributed to the people of the country at all? Or is China just massively producing a lot of steel and shipping it to America, and none of the Chinese consumers get anything, or something like that?
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We've got more comments on the live stream. So Brian says, why would jobs require more skill in a UBI world? And I don't think they necessarily would, or I don't think you should necessarily expect them to. I think, well, it depends. I mean, it depends on where you draw the line between what's a job and what's not. So the things that get paid, at or above the level of whatever today's minimum wage is, you might expect them to require more skill, partly because a lot of the jobs that people are doing are probably jobs we don't need. And therefore don't require that much skill in today's economy. And the only reason that people get hired are a combination of people are desperate for money, they need the job in order to survive, and then labor is dirt cheap. So these businesses are hiring labor, and maybe they wouldn't in a more efficient economy. They'd use some other resources, or they'd go without the labor, or maybe those businesses wouldn't even exist, that kind of thing. So I think you would expect to see kind of the quality of the jobs, and kind of more making the best use of kind of human potential in a GDP or in a UBI world. Bethany, you have your hand up again, or are you?
No, sorry, I'll lower it.
Yeah. And then Henry on the live chat says taxes do not fund government spending, which is, I think, something that a lot of us talk about here in this discussion. And I think when you say something like that, it can be a little bit jarring. So the question I like to ask is, what are the constraints on government spending? So what makes it possible for the government to add money to the economy, to spend money into the economy? And that includes through UBI or any other fiscal program. And the answer to that question is that there has to be something for the money to buy. So I mean, I think it's right that it doesn't line up with taxes. You could have a tax that doesn't allow the government to spend any more money at all, and or maybe a tax that reduces the amount of money the government could spend. If you're taxing carbon, for example, you're reducing the productive potential of the economy, and then there's not as much stuff for the government to buy. Or in the case of basic income, there's not as much stuff for consumers to buy, so you can't fund consumers as much. Yeah, and then he says, when you pay your taxes, the money supply goes down. So that's kind of a quantity theory of money way of thinking about it. And when we talk about supply and demand in economics, usually we're talking about flows, how much stuff in a period of time. There's this weird thing with money where people a lot of the time talk about just kind of like how much money there is in existence, or how much money do people want to hold in a period of time, or in general. And you've got this weird thing where the supply and demand for money are stocks rather than flows, and that kind of thing. I'd encourage you to think about how much money is being spent, how much spending there is, and then how much production there is, and whether those two things line up, rather than kind of how much money there is out there in the economy. So reducing the money stock is not necessarily something that's going to be, anti-inflationary or anything like that. Let's see. Let's go to another quote from the article. Get back onto the topic of GDP. So here we go. So here's kind of the formula for it. So GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Consumption, also called consumer spending, makes up about 70% of GDP and includes all the goods and services individuals buy. In the second quarter of this year, consumer spending increased, but business investment and exports declined, dragged down in part to tariffs on China, leading to the lower number. So this is interesting. Like 70% of GDP is consumer spending. That's our actual domestic consumers, because the exports is another part of the GDP equation. That number doesn't have to stay that way, right? Like if all we're doing is targeting GDP, we could just double our exports, and that would lower the percentage of consumer spending that's going toward GDP, kind of what I talked about before. So the 70% part of it isn't something we should just take for granted, and is largely kind of a product of what our economic policy is. The net exports, in terms of what's being produced for our people, for our economy, consumption, that's our consumers, right? And investment, that's our investment. That's investment in our future economy, that kind of thing. Government spending is generally allocating resources toward the domestic public purpose. So that's for us. The odd man out here is exports. So the idea that you would be counting exports toward the performance of our own economy is a little bit counterintuitive. And of course, exports and imports are related to each other. Like we export things that people import to us. There's trade back and forth going on. But what's closer to what actually matters to people is imports. So I would just remove that net exports term, because what that net exports term does is it adds exports and it subtracts imports. So then instead of talking about the gross domestic product, we'd be talking about not what's being produced by our people, but what's being consumed by our people. I think that corresponds more with the well-being of the people in the economy, if that makes sense. Nobody has their hands up. There's more comments on the live stream. No, they're talking about taxes more, and we don't really need to get into that. We've had a lot of discussions on that kind of stuff. So let's go to another quote. I got plenty of them. how much consumable stuff people produce leaves out a lot of important factors that contribute to well-being, such as a clean environment and good health. An oil spill can increase GDP, for example, because it costs money to clean up, but that also contributes negatively to the environment. So we kind of talked about this a little bit, that GDP is only a reflection of the economic activity. There are lots of things that are outside of economic activity that benefit people. And obviously, if something happens, if there's a disaster, such as an oil spill or, a hurricane or riots destroying, buildings and cars and stuff, the response to that is an increase in GDP. And the increase in GDP that we see, of course, is a reflection of something good, that we're repairing some damage. But if doing the damage is what caused us to repair the damage, then you wouldn't want to do the damage to kind of cause GDP to go up. Go ahead, Bethany.
We just talked about war before. That seems like an example where it wouldn't even be that you're repairing damage necessarily. It could just be like you're creating a bunch of bombs to like destroy other things elsewhere, and then they're destroying stuff on yours. But that's an example where like it just, because you happen to go to war, there's just net waste of a ton of resources. Similar to what you're saying, but even the GDP output could be related just to destruction, and not repair. I guess if you like the war, you could say that's useful, like constructive destruction of other people. But anyway, you get my point.
Yep. So Brian on the live stream says, or he has a question: why does real GDP definition talk about production, but then GDP uses consumption? So the idea is, the way it's calculated is that you look at consumption first, and then you subtract out the stuff that's not consumed by our people, and then you add in the stuff that we produce for other people. So then at the end, you get the production. And I'm saying, if you don't do that step, then you remain with something that's actually more relevant to our domestic economy. So that's kind of like a mistake that GDP makes. And in the end, they do get kind of a calculation of the production rather than the consumption, because they add in the exports and they subtract out the imports. Okay, let's go to another one. Oh, this is a good one. Right now, the unemployment rate is at 3.7%, the lowest it's been in nearly 50 years. And the connection between that number and the GDP is fairly simple. The more people who are working, the more likely the GDP is to be higher, because workers are producing more. So this is kind of coming back to a Goodhart's law type thing. If we had an efficient labor market, then this would generally be true, because people would be hired for productive purposes. But if we are using economic policy to employ people as a way of getting them money, then more people working in terms of the production doesn't necessarily correspond to higher GDP, but the fact that they're getting income and able to buy things, that might be what corresponds to the higher GDP from employing more people. And I think that's what you see today when we increase employment. It's not because, oh, we've got more people working who are producing more stuff. Maybe there's some of that, but most of the effect is, okay, now we've got more people with money to buy more stuff. And that's what causes the additional output. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
How does this point relate to, she also brought up that worker productivity is going down, which I think we had a whole other basic income on, but how does your point that you just made kind of relate to that point?
Yeah, so if you're paying people to spend their time unproductively, just as a way of getting the money, then obviously worker productivity goes down.
Right.
So that's kind of a pretty straightforward.
That was what I was thinking, but yeah.
Yeah. So worker productivity would go up a lot more if we allowed the labor market to be efficient. So if we stopped employing people just to get them money, or we stopped forcing people to work just to get money, then we'd only be employing people productively.
Then that couldn't be an explanation for GDP growth going down, which is what she was talking about necessarily, right?
So in this paragraph, she's talking about, generally speaking, you should expect that if more people are employed, then GDP would go up. And if you have an economy with a natural level of basic income, then is that true anymore? It's an interesting question, because you're always adjusting the basic income so people can activate everything. So maybe the productivity goes up, but the level of employment goes down or something like that, and the economy is producing more. I think the reason why the connection is so strong is not what she says in the paragraph. It's not that there's necessarily more people working and work is efficient, therefore, and work is productive, and therefore we produce more. It's that, oh, we're actually getting money to people and they can buy things that activate the economy. Yeah. Eddie, do you have a comment?
Yeah, so I think again it goes back to capital and labor. So if you hold capital constant and you increase GDP, so the production is done by labor and capital, and so to the degree that you increase GDP, it's likely that people will be able to earn more money through their labor. But the other way to increase GDP, but the capital is a different way to increase GDP. And so, one of the problem occurs when GDP goes up and up and up because you're having more and more capital. But because, again, we don't have UBI, and most people's income is fixed to how much they make through their employment. The capital share of the income, absorbs all the increase in the income, and the workers don't get very much of that increase. So So by increasing the UBI, you would allow production to go up, and you would allow society to continue increasing capital, because right now the place that we're at is that we have so much capital and so little money in people's hands that the entire system is limited by people not having money to spend.
Yes.
And if they had money to spend, and the labor prices went up, productivity could continue going up, capital could continue accumulating. I mean, it's actually again, it goes back to Alan Watts's factory analogy. Capital makes no sense. It makes no sense to build factories if there's no one who has money to buy what the factory is producing.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah, if people have money to spend, that increases more our production now, and it also increases our capital investment. So increases the formation of new capital to produce more stuff for people in the future, especially if you know that they're going to have money to buy the new stuff that you're going to make later. So if you know the basic income is going to go up to activate the additional productive capacity that you might build, then that becomes a profitable proposition. Did you have another comment, Eddie?
No, that's all.
Okay. Let's go to Steve.
I just had a question about GDP and housing. If a house that is not new is sold, does it even count into the current year's GDP?
No, it's a secondary market.
Okay. So I was trying to figure out a way to use GDP. You have the housing market on this side, you have homeless people on this side. Can you look at the numbers and see that there's a problem? Well, you can't, for two reasons. One is old houses don't show up in GDP. The other is that as housing prices for new houses that do show up in GDP, as those prices go more and more astronomical, it makes the housing market or GDP look better, which is, but in the meantime, we have more homeless people, so it's actually worse. So I'm looking for some measure to indicate that that the homeless people are not being served by the housing supply sector. That's all.
Yeah, Eddie, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great example. I wrote an article about why UBI skeptics are skeptical and why they're wrong. And one of the examples that I brought up is that if you look at the statistics, which I'm looking for now, there's 570,000 homeless people in the United States, according to Statista, and there are 16 million vacant housing units in the U.S. So, on the one hand, while you have 500,000 people who are homeless, you also have 16 million housing units which are occupantless. So you have people who need homes on one side, and you have 16 million, 30 times as many houses that are sitting empty, and not earning any rent, because the sole reason being that the homeless people don't have a UBI, so they don't have money to solve the problem, which the market economy could easily do for them, if they just had money in their hands.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess the question is, what's the best way to measure that? And I think maybe that's one of those things where you just measure the number of people who don't have homes, and you measure the number of free houses, and you can look at that and say, okay, we can do better than this. It's not something you would aggregate into GDP. It's kind of like its own thing that's happening. And I think there's a lot of things like that in the economy, right? Like the GDP is not going to give you a fine-grained measure of anything.
I mean, it's free GDP. I mean, if you just print, a number of green slips of paper and distribute them to homeless people, they rent a house, and GDP just goes up. No extra resources required, because those resources are sitting empty right now because people don't have money. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, does rent count toward GDP? I guess that's a service, so probably. Yeah, it's interesting. I actually don't know the details of how that's calculated. And go ahead, Bethany.
We might want this to be something different from like an ideal GDP type measure, but I'm wondering about how a statistic could kind of capture the distribution of spending, or something like that like captures whether it, how not just how the average person's doing, how the lowest person's doing, maybe it's just an inequality plus consumption type combo. I'd have to think about it more carefully, but it seems like something like that is a metric that people would want.
Yeah, I mean, the common measure of inequality is the Gini coefficient. So that has to do with the difference between the richest person and the poorest person. Usually you're measuring incomes or wealth, but you could apply the same method to spending if you wanted to.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking though is like a combination of that and the amount of consumption total. Because the inequality captures just the difference, but it doesn't necessarily capture kind of the quantity that's happening.
And do you want the amount of spending total, or do you want the amount of spending by the poorest people, or yeah,
I guess go to sort of back to our scorecard idea, like what would be a good measure here? Maybe it would just be the poorest people, or maybe you'd have like a few segments, bottom third, middle third, top, or whatever. But
okay. Yeah. And Henry says rent doesn't count toward GDP. He said that in the live stream. Yeah, and I mean, like, I think this measure, again, kind of like I said at the beginning, basic income can be that measure, right? Like if we calibrate the basic income to its natural level, we can see, okay, well, how prosperous is our economy? Yeah. Well, how high is our basic income? So that's going to tell us, the well-being of the people who are worst off, at least the contribution to that well-being of the market economy.
Right. And then the more people are relying on that for their major income, the more of our society it tells you about, I guess, in terms of kind of, doesn't that make sense?
Yeah. Yep. And now Henry's saying he's actually not sure that rent doesn't count toward GDP. So maybe we're taking that back. I don't know. Someone should Google it. Go ahead, Eddie.
So, again, in my view, the relevant division is capital and labor. So if you believe that, then I think a more relevant, they started off with GDP measuring production, but now too many people misuse it. And what they're looking for is how good is the economy? How well are we doing? And so I think a good measure for that would be if you throw out the capital and you say how much income is available through labor. So you could look at what is the UBI, total UBI, and then add the total amount of aggregate wages that is earned. And that would be, a good measure of how much most, non-wealthy people, how much income they have available to spend. I think that would be a good measure.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're looking at people's basic income, and then you're adding in the income that people get from jobs, but you're not adding in the income that people get from capital to get more of a sense of kind of the average person, the average consumer.
Yeah, and you could even divide the population back out and go back to a per capita kind of non-capital income in society. Non-capital. I don't know what a good name was. So someone else has to come up with a good name with it, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, non-capital income. That's interesting. And Mitch Amaya on the YouTube live stream says cursory Googling says rent does count toward GDP. So that might be where we settle. Go ahead, Chance.
Yeah, you said earlier that like you think it would be a better metric or a measure of our societal well-being to sort of measure gross domestic consumption or something like that, and that GDP is really just like those factors then plus exports, kind of.
Yeah, and minus imports, or yeah, just plus exports. You're right.
Plus exports. So it does seem kind of intuitive to me if I just take a really superficial look at it, and I think, you know, exports and GDP as it's calculated now seems to calculate sort of like what we give to the world, and in that sense it's like measuring our importance on the global stage and how much other countries are dependent on us, you know. So in some sense it's measuring our like global security and well-being in some way. Whereas if we just, again, this is like a superficial look, take this consumption angle, we could look at it as like, instead of looking at what we're giving to the world, we're just looking at what we're taking from the world, because we're just as a measure of our health. So it's just like all we're measuring is like what we're consuming, and it's good to consume more, and then it just looks like we're just like this machine eating everything.
Yeah. I think that's right. I would say that exports is maybe not an indicator of our standing in the world. I would say that our standing in the world is what allows us to be this machine that eats everybody's stuff. So we are, if you actually look at the statistics, we have, the United States has a kind of pretty big trade deficit kind of perennially from year to year. So that means we are importing more stuff than we are exporting. And I think that's due to our standing as kind of the world's strongest economy. You know, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. That kind of thing allows us to do that. Eddie, did you have another comment?
Oh, I forgot to take my hand down, but since we're here, I do want to point out that the reserve currency status, the status of the currency, if you look at the history of empires, it's a lagging indicator, and so that that may be strong despite the decline of other measures of the strength of the country.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It would take a little bit of time and effort to dislodge us from that position after we've already messed up a bunch of other stuff. Okay, so we're getting toward the end. Let's get people's final thoughts. We'll start with Mitchell, and then Derek, and then Chance. If you're there, Mitchell, go ahead. I can't hear you, Mitchell. You're not coming through. I see that you unmuted yourself, though.
Okay.
Oh, there you are.
I'm sorry. I was muted on my device as well. It does look like rent is included. I was looking that up. It's included in construction, and it's counted twice. It's counted towards rent, but there's a way they calculate it. I'm not sure yet. But my final thoughts on the basic on GDP is that, it can be a useful measure, but I think there's maybe alternate formulas that could be developed.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Derek, Chance, and then Richard.
We talked a lot about various disadvantages that GDP has in measuring the economy's health and output, and I mean, I agree with all that. I mean, I think if we're going to consider basic income as an alternative measure to GDP, there's an interesting feature of UBI that I think is kind of unique. when we talk about possible macroeconomic measures, because unlike GDP and a lot of other similar values, it's not a sum total and it's not an average. It's a measure of how much to each and every individual constituent member of the society. So it's kind of an aggregate measure, not an average measure. And that's interesting, right? Because people aren't averages, people aren't sum totals. If I'm one person in a group of 1,000 people, if 999 of them are doing really well, but I'm not, then I'm left out of the measure, right? The average is great, the sum total is great, the per capita is great, but I'm not, right? I was excluded for some reason, right? And basic income just straight up doesn't have that problem. By definition, it goes to each and every member of that economy. And that's just interesting, right? It's interesting that we lack another measure that's like that sort of is all inclusive. And that's why that I would say is the primary reason that so far I'm in favor of using that as the measure, because it doesn't suffer from the disadvantages that average and total measures do. And so just the last point on that is just that GDP, you can imagine all through history, it's going to grow, it's going to get bigger, right? But this aggregate measure of how well individual people are doing in total, that could be very bad for large portions of the economy throughout that entire time. Whereas if your UBI was really high hundreds of years ago, you might have a smaller economy, you might have less total output, but I feel like everybody in that society would feel like they were doing really well relative to the GDP that they had. So that's all.
Yeah, I love it. Let's go Chance and then Richard and then Martin.
Yeah, I don't have any concluding thoughts really, other than this has been a great conversation. So thanks as always.
All right. Richard and then Martin and then Steve.
Well, most of the money in our economy is illiquid, and so it doesn't really flow throughout the economy. And well, what I forget who it was talking about before with how our reserve currency status is like a lagging indicator. Well, America is like how do I say, like compared to Rome, and well, Rome, their amount of gold and silver and things like that towards the end was declining and didn't really have much in the way of exports because they were importing exotic goods like silk and like peacocks and things like that for all their parties and they decreased the amount of gold and silver in their currency, and that caused further decline, and that was sort of like inflation in the day. And so status can decline in the amount of like inflation, the amount of like the value of money compared to other currencies and things like that. And so we could America's status is like declining throughout the world because of poor leadership and like our soft power is like we're not using it adequately. We're just like we're going to force people to do things before our big guns and our bombs and things. And so when you use power inefficiently and poorly or whatever, then that forces decline far faster than it would if you're just shipping all your money and your things like that away.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay, we'll go to Martin, Steve, and then Bethany.
So it's an interesting conversation. I've been mostly listening. I guess a couple of takeaways. One, I have this sort of idea that we compete, or there's almost like competition for GDP, as some locale country, whatever, is better because its GDP is higher, another is less. And I wonder sometimes if that, at least notionally, kind of competition is counterproductive, because it causes us maybe to make choices, like say in a political sphere, to choose politicians that promise a greater GDP, when as has come through in this discussion, what are you really saying when you do that? And again, not to really make things sort of political, I mentioned earlier, it's sort of the stock market and current conditions. And, I have a notion that under the current president, there's a certain extolling of the stock market, rising stock market, and this is great. And yet I suspect because of some of the statistics, and even some may have mentioned in this talk about, who owns those types of assets, that that you have a president who's extolling the virtues of a rising stock market, and many people are, perhaps even many of his supporters, and I don't say this politically, but they look at that and think that's a good thing. He extols it, and they agree, and this is good, and it's a growing economy, but they don't even own the assets that he's sort of extolling. And so I guess what I'm trying to describe in the context of GDP is there's this notion of valuing something that is increasing, or some measurement, or, and valuing it. And so many of the people who are buying into valuing it don't have quite the same share in it. And so it's sort of like, why wouldn't you want to sort of shift your allegiance to a measure that might actually sort of double back to your well-being? Anyway, so that's just sort of a thought that I have. And so Eddie, earlier in the talk, he mentioned, sort of this notion of a UBI as a way for others to benefit in a manner similar to wealthy, if you want to call them that, and that own assets that produce income and such. Again, I'll ping on my notion of we have a mechanism like that is called dividend paying stocks, which is ownership and out of profits by election of the officers of the company, a dividend is paid. And, my notion is we have no problem with the idea of people earning income from dividends. So, like, we'd all like to be wealthy enough to do that. And yet, okay, if you're okay with that, and you're sort of thinking UBI, if you're thinking UBI 40 years from now, why don't you consider taking steps today that actually put into the hands, I have a better way to phrase it in Russia, and there's that whole experience, but the voucher program then, but over time to sort of transfer or shift ownership in this broader economy in the form of a dividend paying stock. And, even in our culture, our economy, our capitalist system and everything, shouldn't that be something we'd all be really comfortable with? Because we sure seem to be comfortable with people doing it today, even if only a very small fraction of people do it.
Yeah, I like that. Interesting points. Let's go Steve, Bethany, and then Eddie.
Thanks. So GDP doesn't measure human well-being very well, but I haven't come up with a better measure. Like the article says, it doesn't measure important things like, the healthy environment or unpaid caregivers or leisure time. And even for those of us who would want to keep limited to essentials like food and housing, the list of essentials is sort of always changing. The poorest people in Africa have mobile phones. Mobile phones are now essential. You can't participate in the economy or the nation without a mobile phone. So nobody knows what's essential. So as far as a strategy for selling UBI, I'm giving up on measuring UBI as how is it improving human well-being, because you can't measure human well-being, and you will just get in a quagmire when you start to try to set up the rules for human well-being. So I think it's another reason to just measure UBI, to target UBI just based on a very simple, for instance, a very simple economic indicator like what you call the natural rate, the highest UBI that maximizes production without causing inflation. A very clearly defined thing that avoids the ethical quagmires.
Okay, let's go to Bethany, Eddie, and then Joan.
Yeah, I like this point also about if we had a UBI that was calibrated, using that as one of these indicators. I think it would be pretty natural too, because people would be using it all the time and it would personally affect them. So I'm sure it would become a natural indicator for people. And I guess my question then is like, would we still want something like GDP that's more focused on consumption in addition to that? Would we also want to look at exports and a few other indicators in addition? And how would we do that, given the point brought up in near the beginning of like people kind of liking to gravitate towards one thing? And then of course this point about competition that Barton brought up, I think is also interesting, like between countries, and which measures will we end up gravitating towards with respect to that. So I don't have answers to all those, but those are some kind of concluding questions I have.
Okay, we're gonna go Eddie and then Joan.
I think it's just incredible how win-win UBI is, and again, to the degree, we're already at a point in the economy where we're facing an aggregate demand crash and another Great Depression. When the consumers of the economy don't have money, it is actually impossible for the wealthy to get wealthier, because the wealthy's wealth is, basically machines that produce things for the consumers. So if the consumers can't buy more stuff, the wealthy also cannot get wealthier. So I think we're in the period where it's going to get worse until we fix things, and then it'll get better. So I'm optimistic for the next for 10 years in the future, although there's going to be difficulties in the next few years.
Yeah, well, let's hope we can minimize those difficulties. Go ahead, Joan.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Alex. I learned a lot. Great discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, and we have one comment from David on the live stream. He says, I get the idea of cutting employee benefits because of UBI, but those benefits aren't charity. They are demanded by markets. I'm not convinced that will change. And of course that won't change, but the economic policies we use to set the parameters for the markets, those are charity. And that's what's creating the incentives for these things to happen. So UBI replaces that. I liked everyone's final thoughts, and especially when Derek brought up using basic income as the measure of kind of the economy's contribution to ordinary people. Like I often say, like, well, GDP isn't the best thing because it's not about what's being produced for our people. So I want to talk about absorption or something like that. But really, we don't necessarily want just kind of an average there or an aggregate there. We want and we don't even necessarily care about how much stuff people are buying. We care about how much access consumers have to the economy. And that's what basic income gives us. And it's not just about the average access either. It's about, ensuring that everybody has a certain level of access to what the economy is capable of producing for them. So I really think, I really hope that we can move towards thinking about the economy in that way. And basic income is not going to be subject to Goodhart's law, because it's not an indirect indicator of something. It is the thing we want. So you're not going to have this problem where if you start targeting basic income, then it's not going to reflect the thing you want anymore, because it literally is the thing you want. You're giving the consumers access to the economy. So that was a great discussion, you guys. Next week, we're getting more into stuff related to current events. We're going to talk about law enforcement. How do you enforce laws efficiently? Obviously, we have a society. We need people to be able to cooperate with each other and follow the laws. But there's all kinds of problems that are associated with that. How can basic income maybe make it easier for people to operate within the laws, or for our society to be more cooperative and positive? So we'll talk about that. All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.